life. Your parents believed it, your teachers believed it, it is in children's books and nature documentaries and gardening guides and biology textbooks, and it is almost completely wrong, not slightly wrong, not wrong in the details, wrong in the most fundamental way possible, wrong about where the mass actually comes from. The tree does not come from the ground. The tree comes from the air. I want to start with a man who was wrong about something for 30 years. Not a stupid man, not a careless man, a careful, serious, intelligent man who was genuinely trying to understand something important and who made an error that went undetected for 3 decades because the error was so deeply embedded in the common sense of his time that nobody thought to question it, including him. His name was Jan Baptist van Helmont. He was a Flemish chemist and physician living in the early 1600s. And he decided to do something that almost nobody had done before him in the history of human thought about plants. He decided to actually measure things, to not just observe that plants grow, which everyone had always observed, but to quantify the growth, to put numbers on it, to ask not just how plants grow, but where, specifically and measurably, the material of which they are made actually comes from. This was a genuinely radical idea in 1648. Not because the question was new. People had speculated about plant growth since ancient times, but because Van Helmont wanted to answer it with an experiment rather than with reasoning or authority or intuition. He wanted data, so he did something beautifully simple. He took a willow tree sapling. He weighed it. It weighed 5 pounds. He took a large pot of dried soil. He weighed that too, 200 pounds of dried soil. He planted the willow in the soil. He covered the pot to prevent anything from falling in or out. He watered it with rainwater or distilled water only. Nothing else went in. And he waited. 5 years later, he came back. He took the willow out. He dried the soil and weighed it again. He weighed the tree. The tree weighed 169 pounds. It had gained 164 pounds. It was 30 times heavier than when he planted it. And the soil, the 200 pounds of dried soil, had lost less than 2 ounces. Less than 2 ounces in 5 years, while the tree gained 164 pounds. Van Helmont looked at these numbers and drew the only conclusion that seemed to follow from them. The mass of the tree had not come from the soil. The soil was essentially unchanged. Therefore, the mass must have come from the water. Water was the only thing he had added. Water must be the substance from which the tree was made. The tree had converted water into wood, into bark, into roots, into leaves. Water was the fundamental material of plant substance. This conclusion was wrong. But I want you to notice something about it before I tell you why it was wrong. I want you to notice that it was wrong in an honorable way. Van Helmont did not make a logical error. Given his measurements and given what was known about matter in 1648, his conclusion was reasonable. He had eliminated the most obvious candidate, the soil, with careful measurement. He had identified the only remaining input, the water. And he had concluded that the water must be the answer. The error was not in his reasoning. The error was in what he could not see, what was invisible to him, what was so obvious and so present and so completely taken for granted that it did not even occur to him to include it in his accounting. The air? Van Helmont did not weigh the air. Not because he was careless, because in 1648, the idea that a solid, tangible, heavy object like a tree could be made primarily from something as insubstantial as air was so far outside the available conceptual framework that it simply did not present itself as a hypothesis worth testing. Air was, in the common understanding of Van Helmont's time, basically nothing, a medium through which things moved, not a substance from which things were made, not something you could weave into wood. He was looking for the answer in the wrong place. Not because he was foolish, because the right place was invisible to him, hidden in plain sight, literally surrounding the tree on all sides, every moment of every day, being absorbed continuously, being converted continuously into the solid substance of wood and bark and root and leaf. And he never thought to look there. This is one of my favorite stories in the history of science. Not because Van Helmont was wrong, but because of the specific way he was wrong, because of what his error reveals about how we think and what we see and what we miss, because it is too obvious and too familiar and too everywhere to register as a candidate for what we are looking for. The thing that was building the tree was the thing that Van Helmont was breathing while he was conducting his experiment. It surrounded him. It surrounded the tree. It was in direct contact with every leaf of that willow for every second of its 5 years of growth. And it did not occur to him that it might be the answer, because it was air, and air was nothing. Now, let me tell you what is actually happening. Let me build the real story from the beginning. Not because the real story is complicated, though it has complicated parts, but because the real story is so much more beautiful and so much more strange and so much more connected to the deepest questions about how life works that getting it right is worth the effort. Start here. A carbon dioxide molecule. One carbon atom bonded to two oxygen atoms. A tiny molecule, invisible, weighing almost nothing in any human sense, drifting through the atmosphere at room temperature, bouncing around at several hundred meters per second, completely indistinguishable by any human sense from the nitrogen and oxygen molecules around it. Tasteless, odorless, invisible, apparently inert, just part of the air. Now bring that molecule into contact with a leaf that is, at the molecular level, an extraordinary piece of machinery. A leaf that is packed with structures called chloroplasts, and inside each chloroplast are stacks of membrane-bound discs called thylakoids, and embedded in those membranes are molecular complexes of almost incomprehensible sophistication, protein complexes that contain specific arrangements of chlorophyll molecules, which are themselves remarkable structures. A magnesium ion at the center of a ring of carbon and nitrogen atoms, arranged precisely to absorb photons of specific wavelengths of light. Green light is reflected, which is why leaves are green. Red and blue light is absorbed. And the energy of those absorbed photons is the energy that drives everything that follows. When a photon of the right wavelength strikes a chlorophyll molecule, it excites an electron, knocks it up into a higher energy state. And this excited electron does not just fall back down and release the energy as heat the way an excited electron in most molecules would. Instead, it gets passed along a chain of molecular carriers, each at a slightly lower energy level than the one before, like a ball rolling down a staircase. And as the electron cascades down this chain, the energy it releases is captured and used to do something specific and important. It pumps protons across a membrane, and those pumped protons, flowing back across the membrane through a remarkable molecular turbine called ATP synthase, drive the synthesis of ATP, adenosine triphosphate, the universal energy currency of living cells, the molecule that stores the energy from sunlight in a chemical form that can be used to do work anywhere in the cell. So sunlight becomes ATP. Energy from a star, 93 million miles away, absorbed by a chlorophyll molecule in a leaf, converted through this cascade of electron transfers and proton pumping into a chemical bond in a molecule of ATP. This is the first part of photosynthesis, the light reactions. And I want you to hold in your mind what is actually happening here. A photon that left the surface of the sun 8 minutes ago is being converted by molecular machinery in a leaf into chemical energy. The leaf is a solar panel, but a solar panel of such extraordinary efficiency and sophistication that the best human technology does not come close. Now, the second part, the carbon fixation. This is where the carbon dioxide molecule I described at the beginning finally enters the story. Because the ATP produced in the light reactions is used to power a cycle of chemical reactions discovered by Melvin Calvin in the 1950s and now called the Calvin cycle, that takes carbon dioxide molecules from the air and incorporates the carbon atoms into organic molecules. Let me be very specific about what this means. Carbon dioxide is CO2. 1 carbon, 2 oxygen. In the Calvin cycle, the carbon atom is pulled out of the carbon dioxide and incorporated into a chain of carbon atoms. The oxygen atoms are released. The carbon becomes part of a growing organic molecule. Specifically, eventually, after several turns of the cycle, it becomes glucose, a 6-carbon sugar, C6H12O6. 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, 6 oxygens, and the carbons, every single one of them, came from carbon dioxide molecules pulled from the air. The hydrogens came from water. The oxygen in the water is released as oxygen gas. The oxygen you are breathing right now, produced as a byproduct of the photosynthetic splitting of water molecules. The carbons came from the air. Now, glucose is not wood. Glucose is not bark. Glucose is not cellulose or lignin or any of the structural materials that make up the solid body of a tree. But glucose is the starting material from which all of those things are made. The tree takes glucose and uses it to build everything. Cellulose, The main structural component of plant cell walls is a polymer of glucose. Long chains of glucose molecules linked together into fibers that are pound for pound stronger than steel. Lignin, the material that makes wood hard and rigid, is built from smaller organic molecules derived ultimately from glucose. The proteins in the tree's cells are built from amino acids synthesized from molecules derived ultimately from glucose. Everything solid in the tree, every molecule of every structural component, built from carbon atoms, and the carbon atoms came from carbon dioxide. From the air, Van Helmont weighed the soil. He did not weigh the air, but the air was the answer all along. Now, let me put some numbers on this to make it real, because I think the numbers are important. I think without the numbers, this remains an interesting fact rather than a genuinely shocking. A mature oak tree weighs roughly 20,000 kilograms. 20,000 kilograms of solid material. Wood, bark, roots, leaves, everything. Of that 20,000 kilograms, roughly half is carbon by dry weight. 10,000 kilograms of carbon. Every single one of those 10,000 kilograms of carbon was once a carbon dioxide molecule floating in the atmosphere. The tree has pulled 10,000 kilograms of carbon out of the air and incorporated it into solid wood. 10,000 kilograms from the air that you can wave your hand through without resistance, that you breathe without noticing, that Van Helmont never thought to weigh because it seemed like nothing. It was not nothing. It was the tree. And this is not unique to oaks. Every tree, every plant, every blade of grass, every algae in the ocean, every crop in every field, built from carbon pulled from the air. The air is the source. The ground provides minerals and water, important things, necessary things. But the bulk, the mass, the stuff of which the plant is made, from the air. Now I want to tell you something about this that I find genuinely astonishing. Something that connects the tree in your backyard to the deepest history of life on Earth, and to the chemistry of the atmosphere, and to the question of where the oxygen you are breathing right now actually came from. Because this has not always been happening. Photosynthesis is not an ancient, eternal feature of the Earth's surface. It is, on the geological timescale, a relatively recent invention. And before it was invented, before the first photosynthetic organisms figured out how to pull carbon from the air and use sunlight to build organic molecules, the Earth looked completely different. The atmosphere looked completely different. And the history of how photosynthesis changed everything is one of the most dramatic stories in the 4 billion year history of life. Let me take you there. I want to take you back 3 billion years. Not because ancient history is intrinsically interesting, though it is, but because what happened 3 billion years ago is directly responsible for the fact that you are alive right now. Directly responsible for the oxygen in your lungs. Directly responsible for the carbon in every cell of your body. Directly responsible for the fact that trees exist at all. And understanding it changes what you see when you look at a tree. Changes it in a way that I think is permanent. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. 3 billion years ago, the Earth's atmosphere contained almost no oxygen. This is worth sitting with for a moment because it is so contrary to our intuition about what the Earth is and has always been. We think of oxygen as fundamental, as natural, as the default state of the atmosphere. The air is what it is and has always been what it is. But no, 3 billion years ago, the atmosphere was mostly nitrogen and carbon dioxide and water vapor, a thick blanket of carbon dioxide. No free oxygen, not a trace. An animal that somehow found itself on that ancient Earth would die within minutes. Not from the cold, not from predators, not from any dramatic cause. Simply from the absence of the one thing that animal metabolism requires absolutely, oxygen. The Earth, at that time, was inhabited entirely by microorganisms, single-celled creatures, the ancestors of all life that has ever lived on this planet. And these creatures were doing chemistry, not photosynthesis, not yet. Other kinds of chemistry, fermentation, chemosynthesis, various metabolic strategies that did not require oxygen and did not produce it. Life existed, but it was confined to a world of chemistry that looks almost alien compared to the biochemistry we are familiar with. And then something happened, somewhere in the shallow waters of an ancient ocean, approximately 2.5 to 3 billion years ago, a lineage of microorganisms stumbled onto something remarkable, a new trick, a new metabolic pathway. The ability to use sunlight to split water molecules and use the energy in the hydrogen atoms thereby released to fix carbon dioxide into organic molecules, photosynthesis. The same process I described in the leaf, the same chlorophyll, the same electron transport chain, the same ATP synthase, the same Calvin cycle. The fundamental chemistry has not changed in 3 billion years. These ancient microorganisms, called cyanobacteria, invented the process that every plant on Earth still uses today. And the byproduct of splitting water is oxygen. Every time a water molecule is split, an oxygen atom is released. And cyanobacteria, splitting water molecules by the trillion, by the quadrillion, by numbers that strain the imagination, began releasing oxygen into the ocean and from the ocean into the atmosphere. At first, nothing dramatic happened. The oxygen was absorbed as fast as it was produced. The ancient oceans contained dissolved iron, enormous quantities of it, and oxygen reacts with iron. The oxygen combined with the iron and precipitated out as iron oxide, rust, settling to the ocean floor. The evidence of this process is visible today in geological formations called banded iron formations, alternating layers of iron-rich and iron-poor rock laid down over hundreds of millions of years as the cyanobacteria produced oxygen and the ocean absorbed it. These formations are some of the most important ores we mine for iron today. The iron in the steel in your buildings and your cars was deposited by the metabolic activity of ancient microorganisms 3 billion years ago. But eventually the iron ran out. The ocean could not absorb the oxygen fast enough, and oxygen began to accumulate in the atmosphere. And this was, for most of the life on Earth at the time, a catastrophe. Because oxygen is chemically reactive, violently reactive from the perspective of organisms that had evolved in its absence. Oxygen reacts with the organic molecules of which living things are made. It oxidizes them, destroys them, burns them in the slow, molecular sense of burning. For most of the organisms alive at the time, the accumulation of oxygen in the atmosphere was a mass extinction event. The Great Oxidation Event, as geologists call it, which happened roughly 2.5 billion years ago, was probably the most dramatic change in the surface chemistry of the Earth in its entire history. An atmosphere that had been free of oxygen for 2 billion years suddenly began to accumulate it, and the organisms that could not cope with this reactive new gas died in enormous numbers over enormous time scales. This event is sometimes called the oxygen holocaust, which is a dramatic name, but it captures something real. The rise of oxygen was, from the perspective of the organisms that could not handle it, genuinely catastrophic. The waste product of one form of life was the poison of almost everything else. But some organisms survived. Some had, by chance, evolved mechanisms for dealing with oxygen. Enzymes that neutralized its reactive forms. Metabolic pathways that could actually use oxygen rather than being destroyed by it. And these organisms, the ancestors of everything that breathes oxygen today, discovered something remarkable. That oxygen is not just a poison to be detoxified, it is an extraordinarily powerful energy source. Aerobic respiration, the process by which you and I and every animal on Earth extracts energy from food, is essentially the reverse of photosynthesis. Photosynthesis uses sunlight energy to take carbon dioxide and water and build organic molecules like glucose. Aerobic respiration takes those organic molecules and oxygen and burns them, extracting the stored solar energy and releasing carbon dioxide and water as byproducts. The energy yield of aerobic respiration is roughly 18 times greater than the energy yield of anaerobic metabolism. The organisms that learned to use oxygen could extract vastly more energy from the same amount of food. And this energetic windfall, this sudden access to a far more powerful energy source, is what made complex multicellular life possible, made animals possible, made you possible. You are powered by oxygen, the oxygen that was produced as a waste product of photosynthesis by cyanobacteria 3 billion years ago, the oxygen that killed most of the life on Earth when it first accumulated, the oxygen that you cannot live without for more than a few minutes, and the carbon in your body, every atom of it, was once carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, was fixed by photosynthesis, was incorporated into a plant or an alga, was eaten by something, was passed along a food chain until some version of it ended up in you. The carbon in your cells has been through many cycles, has been in many organisms, has been in the air many times, but it all traces back, ultimately, to photosynthesis, to the process by which carbon dioxide is pulled from the air and built into solid organic matter. You are at the atomic level, rearranged air. Let me say that again because I think it deserves emphasis. The carbon in your body was atmospheric carbon dioxide, fixed by photosynthesis, passed through food chains, incorporated into you. You are made of air, organized, rearranged, complexity-bearing air. But air? Van Helmont was looking for where the tree came from. He did not know he was also looking for where he came from. The same answer applies to both. Now I want to come back to the tree, because I have been talking about deep history, and I want to return to the immediate, visible, you can go outside and look at it phenomenon of a tree growing. Because I think there is something about the actual moment-to-moment mechanics of how a tree builds itself from air that is even more extraordinary than the basic fact that it does. Consider what is happening right now in a leaf on a tree outside your window. Assuming it is daytime and the sun is shining and the leaf is green and photosynthesizing, carbon dioxide is entering the leaf through tiny pores called stomata, microscopic openings in the leaf surface, each one controlled by a pair of guard cells that can open or close the pore in response to conditions. When light is available and water is sufficient, the stomata open and carbon dioxide diffuses in. When water is scarce, the stomata close to prevent water loss, even at the cost of stopping carbon fixation. Inside the leaf, the carbon dioxide diffuses through the air spaces between cells until it reaches a cell containing chloroplasts. Inside the chloroplasts, it enters the Calvin cycle. The carbon atom is pulled from the CO2 molecule and attached to an existing 5-carbon molecule called RuBP, ribulose bisphosphate, by an enzyme called RuBisCO. RuBisCO, ribulose bisphosphate carboxylase oxygenase, the most abundant protein on Earth, literally the most abundant protein on Earth. There are approximately 700 million tons of RuBisCO in the biosphere right now. It is in every photosynthesizing organism, every plant, every alga, every cyanobacterium. It is the enzyme that fixes carbon. That takes carbon dioxide and incorporates the carbon into organic molecules. That pulls carbon out of the air and builds the world. And it is, by enzyme standards, remarkably slow. Most enzymes catalyze thousands of reactions per second. RuBisCO manages only 3 to 10 carbon fixation events per second. It is slow and it is clumsy. It occasionally grabs an oxygen molecule instead of a carbon dioxide molecule, which is not just unproductive but actually counterproductive, requiring energy to undo. It is, by the standards of molecular machinery, inefficient. And yet it is what runs the world. It is what built the coal and oil deposits that power our civilization. It is what built the forests. It is what built the food that everything eats. The slow, clumsy, inefficient RuBisCO, working at 3 reactions per second, is the engine of the biosphere. And the reason there is so much of it, the reason it is the most abundant protein on Earth, is exactly because it is slow. Plants compensate for its slowness by making enormous quantities of it, pack the chloroplasts with RuBisCO, make up in quantity what is lost in speed. Now, the carbon that RuBisCO has just fixed, the carbon atom that has been pulled from the carbon dioxide molecule and attached to the 5-carbon chain, what happens to it? It proceeds through the Calvin cycle, several more enzymatic steps. It ends up as a 3-carbon molecule called glyceraldehyde, 3-phosphate G3P, and G3P is the fundamental output of photosynthesis, the raw material from which the tree builds everything. From G3P, the tree builds glucose. From glucose, it builds sucrose, the transport sugar that moves carbon from leaves through the phloem to wherever it is needed in the tree, to the growing tips, to the roots, to the developing seeds. Everywhere that building is happening, sucrose arrives and provides the carbon and the energy. At the growing tip of a branch, cells are dividing rapidly. New cells are being made. Each new cell needs a cell wall made primarily of cellulose. Cellulose is built from glucose units. The glucose was built from G3P. The G3P was built from carbon dioxide. The carbon in the cell wall was atmosphere. At the cambium, the thin layer of dividing cells just beneath the bark, new wood is being added, new xylem cells, dead cells, hollowed out, their walls thickened with cellulose and lignin, forming the tubes through which water will travel from roots to leaves. The lignin is built from compounds derived from glucose. The cellulose is built from glucose. The carbon was atmosphere. At the root tips, cells are dividing, growing, pushing into the soil, not to absorb the bulk material of the tree, not to find the carbon that will become wood, but to find water and dissolve minerals, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, iron, trace elements, important things, necessary things. The tree cannot grow without them, but they are not the bulk of the tree. They are the catalysts and the cofactors and the structural elements of proteins and membranes and chlorophyll, the stuff of the machinery, not the stuff of the building itself. The building is done with carbon, and the carbon comes from above, not from below, from the air, not from the ground. This is what Van Helmont missed. This is what almost everyone misses. Because we look at a tree and we see it rooted in the ground, and we see the roots going down, and we see the soil, and we think the tree is eating the soil. The tree is drawing its substance from the earth. The same way a stone is of the earth, a tree is of the earth, connected, rooted, earthen. But the tree is not earthen. The tree is aerial. It is a structure built from the sky, anchored to the ground, watered by the ground, minerally supported by the ground. But materially, substantially, massively, it is made of air, made of carbon dioxide molecules that were floating in the atmosphere, invisible and weightless, until a leaf caught them and a molecule of RuBisCO grabbed them and a cascade of chemistry turned them into wood. And now I want to tell you something about what this means. Not just as a fact about trees, as a fact about the relationship between life and the atmosphere, between the living world and the chemical composition of the air, between the tree in your backyard and the climate of the entire planet. Because the trees are not just made of atmospheric carbon, the trees are storing atmospheric carbon. Every kilogram of wood in every tree on Earth is a kilogram of carbon that is not in the atmosphere. And the implications of this are enormous. I want to tell you about a number that should disturb you. Not because it is frightening in the way that danger is frightening, but because it reveals something about the scale of what trees are doing that I think most people have never fully appreciated. A number that puts the relationship between trees, carbon, and the atmosphere in a perspective that changes how you see a forest. The number is 450. 450 billion tons. That is the estimated mass of carbon currently stored in the living biomass of all the trees on Earth. 450 billion tons of carbon, pulled from the atmosphere, locked into wood, held in the solid, stable, centuries-long form of tree trunks and branches and roots. To put that in perspective, the entire atmosphere contains roughly 850 billion tons of carbon, mostly in the form of carbon dioxide. The trees hold more than half that amount, not in the atmosphere, in wood, in the solid, visible, you can touch it form of forests. The trees are, in a very real sense, a reservoir of atmospheric carbon that has been temporarily removed from the air and stored in biological form. A vast, global, living carbon bank. And every time a tree grows, it is making a withdrawal from the atmospheric carbon account and depositing it into the biological carbon account. And every time a tree burns or rots or is cut down and decomposed, it is making the reverse transaction, returning stored carbon to the atmosphere. This is why forests matter to climate. Not in the vague, hand-waving way that people sometimes talk about it, in the specific, quantitative, you can put numbers on it way. Forests are carbon storage. Large forests store large amounts of carbon. Destroying large forests releases that stored carbon back into the atmosphere. The Amazon rainforest alone stores roughly 150 to 200 billion tons of carbon. Burning it, or allowing it to be cleared and decomposed, would release that carbon as carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, adding to the roughly 300 billion tons of carbon that human industrial activity has already added since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. But I do not want to turn this into a lecture about climate. I want to use this number to make a point about something more fundamental, about what photosynthesis actually is and what it has actually done to this planet over the billions of years it has been operating. Because 450 billion tons of carbon in living biomass is just the current snapshot. The amount stored right now in living trees, it does not include the carbon stored in dead organic matter in soils. It does not include the carbon stored in peat bogs and wetlands. It does not include the carbon stored in ocean sediments as the remains of countless generations of marine organisms. And it does not include the most dramatic form of biological carbon storage on Earth, the fossil fuels, coal, oil, natural gas. These are photosynthesis. ancient photosynthesis. Carbon dioxide that was pulled from the atmosphere by ancient plants and algae, incorporated into organic molecules, buried before it could be oxidized back to carbon dioxide, compressed and chemically transformed over millions of years into the carbon-rich deposits we now extract and burn. When you burn coal, you are releasing carbon dioxide that was removed from the atmosphere by photosynthesis 300 million years ago. When you burn oil, you are releasing carbon that was fixed by marine algae 50 to 100 million years ago. The fossil fuels are ancient sunlight, solar energy captured by photosynthesis, stored as reduced carbon, preserved in geological deposits, and burning them is, in the most literal chemical sense, the reverse of photosynthesis. You are taking the products of ancient photosynthesis and running the reaction backwards, converting stored organic carbon back into carbon dioxide and water. The carbon cycle, the movement of carbon between the atmosphere, the living world, the soils, the oceans, and the geological formations, is perhaps the most important chemical cycle on Earth. And photosynthesis is the engine that drives it, the pump that moves carbon from the atmospheric pool into the biological pool. Without photosynthesis, carbon would accumulate in the atmosphere as carbon dioxide, and there would be no organic matter, no food, no fuel, no life as we know it. Now, I want to take you somewhere more intimate, more immediate, more personally relevant than the global carbon cycle, because I think all of this can feel very large and very abstract and very far from the actual experience of standing next to a tree and looking at it. I want to talk about what a tree actually is, not chemically, not climatically, structurally, architecturally, because the way a tree builds itself from air is not just chemically interesting, it is mechanically extraordinary. And understanding the mechanics, understanding how a tree builds something strong enough to stand 60 feet tall and resist hurricane winds using material made from invisible gas, is one of the most remarkable engineering stories in the natural world. Start with cellulose. I mentioned it before. The primary structural material of plant cell walls. A polymer of glucose. Long, unbranched chains of glucose molecules linked together in a specific way, a beta-1,4 linkage, that gives the chains a flat, ribbon-like shape. And these flat chains stack on top of each other, and hydrogen bonds form between them, and they bundle together into microfibrils. Long, crystalline, extraordinarily strong fibers. The tensile strength of cellulose microfibrils is roughly comparable to steel. Pound for pound, cellulose fibers are as strong as mild steel in tension. This is the material that the tree builds from glucose that was built from carbon dioxide that was floating in the air. The tree is spinning atmospheric carbon into something as strong as steel. But cellulose alone, strong as it is not rigid. A bundle of steel cables is strong in tension but floppy in compression. You cannot build a skyscraper from cables alone. You need something that resists compression as well as tension, something rigid, something that keeps the structure from buckling under load. That is what lignin does. Lignin is the second major structural component of wood, a complex polymer, not of glucose, but of smaller aromatic molecules derived from glucose, polymerized into a three-dimensional network that fills the spaces between and within the cellulose fibers. Lignin is what makes wood hard and rigid rather than flexible and fibrous. It is the matrix that holds the cellulose fibers in place and prevents them from sliding past each other. Together, cellulose and lignin create a composite material, fibers embedded in a matrix that is strong in both tension and compression. The same structural principle as fiberglass or carbon fiber reinforced plastic, a high-strength fiber embedded in a rigid matrix. Only the tree figured this out 360 million years ago. And this composite material, this wood, built from atmospheric carbon dioxide by the biochemistry of photosynthesis and cell growth, is what allows a tree to do something that should seem, when you think about it carefully, almost impossible. To build a self-supporting tower 60, 80, sometimes over 100 meters tall, out of material grown from gas, using no bolts or welds or external scaffolding, and to maintain that tower through decades or centuries of wind and snow and ice and the slow, relentless pull of gravity. The tallest trees in the world are the coastal redwoods of California. Some of them are over 115 meters tall, taller than a 30-story building. They stand without any external support. They resist winds that would topple any building of comparable height that was not specifically engineered to withstand them. They have been standing, some of them, for over 2,000 years. And every gram of the wood that holds them up was built from carbon dioxide that was floating in the air. Now I want to tell you something about how the tree manages the process of building itself, because it is not a passive process, not a simple chemical reaction that just runs to completion once it is started. The tree actively manages its own construction in ways that are remarkably sophisticated. Consider how a tree responds to mechanical stress. When a tree grows in an open space with no wind, it grows relatively slender, allocating as little material as possible to structural support and as much as possible to height and leaf area. But when a tree grows in a windy location, it responds to the mechanical stimulation of the wind by producing different kinds of wood. Denser, stronger, more heavily lignified wood on the side that bears the greatest stress. The tree is sensing the loads on its structure and adjusting its material properties in response, growing more wood where more wood is needed, less where less is needed. This is called thigmomorphogenesis, growth in response to mechanical stimulation. And it means that the tree is, in a real sense, engineering itself, responding to the forces acting on it and producing a structure that is optimized for those forces. Not through any conscious deliberation, through a cascade of molecular signals. When a cell is mechanically stressed, it changes which genes are expressed. It produces different proteins. It builds different cell walls. The chemistry of wood production changes in response to the mechanical environment. The tree does not think, but it computes. It integrates information about its mechanical environment and adjusts its structural response accordingly. And the result is a structure that is extraordinarily well adapted to the specific loads it faces. This is why trees grown in greenhouses, protected from wind, often fail when they are transplanted outdoors. They have grown without the mechanical stimulation that would have prompted the production of strong reaction wood. They are structurally underdeveloped for the mechanical demands of the open environment. They snap in winds that a naturally grown tree of the same size would survive easily. The wood needs stress to become strong. The tree builds strength in response to challenge, which is, I cannot help noticing, a principle that extends somewhat beyond trees. Now I want to tell you about something in the tree that I find genuinely wonderful. Not just interesting, not just scientifically important, wonderful in the specific sense of producing wonder, of making me feel something I can only describe as a kind of awe at the elegance of what natural selection has produced over hundreds of millions of years. It is the xylem, the plumbing system of the tree, the system that moves water from the roots to the leaves against gravity up to heights of over 100 meters in the tallest trees. Without a pump, let me repeat that. The tallest trees on Earth move water from their roots to their leaves, a vertical distance of over 100 meters, against the full force of gravity without any pump. There is no heart in a tree, no mechanical device that pressurizes the water and forces it upward. The water moves on its own. How? The answer involves one of the most remarkable physical phenomena in all of biology. And it starts not in the roots, but in the leaves. In the leaves, water is evaporating. Through the stomata, the same pores through which carbon dioxide enters, water vapor is leaving, constantly, continuously, in enormous quantities. A single large tree on a hot summer day can transpire 400 liters of water, 400 liters evaporating from the leaves every day. And as water evaporates from the leaf cells, those cells become slightly more concentrated. Their water potential drops, and this drop in water potential at the top of the tree creates a pull, a tension, a suction that propagates downward through the water column in the xylem. The water in the xylem is under tension, negative pressure, being pulled upward by the evaporative demand at the top. This sounds impossible. Water under tension. We do not usually think of water as something that can be pulled. We think of water as something that responds to pressure, pushing it. But water can sustain significant tension. Because water molecules are strongly attracted to each other by hydrogen bonds and to the walls of the narrow xylem tubes by adhesion, the water column does not break. It is continuous from the roots to the leaves. And the tension at the top, generated by evaporation, pulls the entire column upward. This is called the cohesion tension theory of water transport in plants. Cohesion, the tendency of water molecules to stick to each other. Tension, the pulling force generated by evaporation at the leaves. Together they create a passive, pump-free mechanism for moving water to the tops of the tallest trees. The engineering is exquisite. The xylem vessels are narrow enough that the surface tension forces are sufficient to keep the water column intact against the tensile stress. The cell walls are lignified to withstand the negative pressures without collapsing inward. The system is redundant, many parallel pathways, so that if one vessel is broken by a bubble of air, the others continue to function. And the whole thing runs on evaporation, on the same thermodynamics that makes your skin feel cool when it is wet, on the tendency of water molecules to escape from a liquid surface into the air, the most ordinary physics driving water to the tops of 100-meter trees. The tree takes carbon from the air. It lifts water from the ground to the sky, using the sky itself, using the dryness of the air as the pump. It builds the strongest structural material in the biological world from invisible gas. It captures sunlight with a precision and efficiency that our best technology cannot match. And it does all of this without a brain, without conscious intention, without any of the deliberate, planned, designed engineering that we require to build things a fraction as elegant. Van Helmont looked at a tree and asked where it came from. He was asking the right question. He just did not know how extraordinary the answer was going to be. I want to tell you about a conversation I imagine having with a tree. Not a mystical conversation, not a poetic one, a physics conversation. The kind of conversation where you ask something seemingly simple and the answer keeps revealing deeper and deeper layers until you are somewhere completely unexpected, somewhere you never anticipated when you asked the first question. I would start by asking the tree something direct. I would say, "What are you made of?" And if the tree could answer, if it could give me an honest accounting of its own composition, it would say something like this: "I am made of carbon, mostly. Carbon arranged into long chains and rings and polymers, cellulose and lignin and proteins and lipids and sugars and 1,000 other organic molecules, all built on carbon skeletons. Carbon is the backbone of everything I am, and the carbon came from carbon dioxide in the air. I am also made of hydrogen and oxygen, from water, mostly, water that came from the soil, pulled up through my xylem by the tension generated by evaporation from my leaves. The hydrogen in my organic molecules, in my cellulose and my lignin and my proteins, came from the splitting of water molecules in the light reactions of photosynthesis. I am made of nitrogen. In every protein I have ever built, in every molecule of chlorophyll, in every nucleotide, of every strand of DNA, in every cell, nitrogen from the soil, fixed by bacteria, absorbed through my roots, incorporated into amino acids and nucleotides, and the other nitrogen-containing molecules that make up my biochemistry. I am made of phosphorus. In every molecule of ATP that has ever powered a reaction in my cells, in every phospholipid, in every cell membrane I have ever built. Phosphorus from the soil, dissolved and absorbed, incorporated into the molecules of energy transfer and structural integrity. And I am made of trace elements, iron in my chlorophyll, magnesium at the center of every chlorophyll molecule, the atom that makes the light absorption possible, potassium in my guard cells, regulating the opening and closing of my stomata, calcium in my cell walls, manganese, copper, zinc, molybdenum, each playing specific roles in specific enzymes without which the chemistry would not work. But here is the accounting that matters most. By mass, by the sheer quantity of atoms that make up my body, I am mostly carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And those three elements came overwhelmingly from the air and from water. The minerals from the soil are essential, but they are a small fraction of my total mass. Most of me is air and water, rearranged by chemistry and energy into the complexity you see. This is what the tree would tell you if it could speak the language of chemistry. Now I want to push the conversation further, because there is something about the tree's composition that leads to a question I find extraordinarily interesting. A question that Van Helmont could not have asked, that nobody could have properly asked before the development of modern chemistry and physics. But that we can ask now, and that has an answer that is, I think, one of the most beautiful things in all of biology. The question is this: how does the tree know what to build? Not how does it get the raw materials. We have covered that. Carbon from the air, water from the soil, minerals from the soil, sunlight for energy. How does it know what to do with those materials? How does it know to build cellulose instead of some other polymer of glucose? How does it know to build lignin in the right places and not in the wrong places? How does it know to grow branches upward and roots downward? How does it know to produce more wood on the side that is mechanically stressed? How does it know when a pest attacks one part of it to produce defensive chemicals in other parts that have not yet been attacked? The answer is, information. Specifically, genetic information. The sequence of nucleotides in the DNA in every cell of the tree contains the instructions for building every protein the tree will ever make. And the proteins are what? Do everything. The enzymes that catalyze every chemical reaction, the structural proteins that give cells their shape, the regulatory proteins that turn genes on and off in response to signals from the environment, the receptor proteins that detect light and gravity and mechanical stress and chemical signals from other organisms. The tree is, in the most fundamental sense, an information processing system. A system that reads the instructions encoded in DNA, translates them into proteins through the molecular machinery of ribosomes, and uses those proteins to transform simple raw materials, carbon dioxide, water, minerals, sunlight, into the organized complexity of a living organism. And the information itself, the sequence of nucleotides in the tree's DNA, is the product of roughly 400 million years of evolution. 400 million years of trees and the earlier land plants from which they descended, living and dying and reproducing, with the trees that happen to have slightly better instructions, surviving slightly better and leaving slightly more descendants. Each generation, a tiny refinement of the instructions. Each refinement preserved in the sequence of nucleotides that is passed from parent to offspring in every seed. The instructions for building a tree that are encoded in an acorn are the accumulated product of 400 million years of editing, 400 million years of trial and error. Every error that proved fatal eliminated from the gene pool. Every improvement that proved beneficial, preserved and refined. This is why the xylem is designed so elegantly. This is why the cellulose-lignin composite is such an effective structural material. This is why the stomata open and close in response to exactly the right signals. This is why the Calvin cycle is organized the way it is. Not because any engineer designed them, because 400 million years of selection pressure acted on random variation and kept what worked and eliminated what did not. The tree is a solution, an approximate, imperfect, but extraordinarily sophisticated solution to the problem of surviving and reproducing in a world with sunlight and water and carbon dioxide and soil and competitors and predators and parasites and physical stresses. The solution was found not by intelligence, but by the blind, patient, relentless process of natural selection working on variation over geological time. And the solution works. It works so well that trees have been the dominant large organisms on land for most of the time since they first appeared. They have survived mass extinctions, they have survived ice ages, they have survived the rise and fall of the dinosaurs. They have survived everything the earth has thrown at them, adapting, evolving, refining the solution with each generation. Now I want to tell you about something in trees that I think is one of the most extraordinary discoveries in biology in the past 30 years. Something that completely overturned the way scientists thought about trees. Something that makes the individual tree, already remarkable enough, seem almost like the wrong unit of analysis, the wrong scale at which to understand what a forest actually is. I am talking about mycorrhizal networks. You know that trees have roots. You know that roots absorb water and dissolve minerals from the soil. What you may not know is that in the vast majority of tree species, the roots do not do this alone. They do it in partnership. In intimate, ancient, biochemically sophisticated partnership with fungi. Mycorrhizal fungi are fungi that form symbiotic associations with plant roots. The fungus grows into and around the root cells, creating an interface between the plant's tissues and the fungal tissues. And through this interface, an exchange takes place. The plant supplies the fungus with sugars, glucose, and sucrose, products of photosynthesis, carbon that the fungus cannot produce itself because fungi cannot photosynthesize. In return, the fungus supplies the plant with water and dissolved minerals, particularly phosphorus and nitrogen, that the plant cannot access effectively with its roots alone. Because the fungal hyphae, the thread-like filaments that make up the fungal body, are far finer than the finest root hairs. They can penetrate into soil pores that roots cannot reach. They have an enormously greater surface area than roots alone. They can access water and minerals in places and at concentrations that would be inaccessible to the plant without them. The fungus is, in effect, an extension of the plant's root system. A biological extension that dramatically increases the plant's access to soil resources. This partnership, this mycorrhizal symbiosis, is ancient. Fossil evidence suggests it dates back at least 450 million years to when plants first colonized land. It may have been the partnership that made the colonization of land possible. The first land plants, arriving in a world of bare rock and primitive soil with very little available phosphorus, may have been able to establish themselves only because they already had fungal partners that could access the mineral resources locked in the rock. And the partnership has persisted and deepened for 450 million years. Approximately 90% of all plant species form mycorrhizal associations. It is not an optional extra. It is a fundamental feature of how most plants grow. But here is what makes it truly extraordinary. The fungal hyphae do not just connect a single plant to the soil. They connect multiple plants to each other. The same network of fungal threads that connects to the roots of one tree extends through the soil and connects to the roots of neighboring trees. Different trees, sometimes different species, connected through a common fungal network. And through this network, material moves, carbon moves. The sugars that one tree produces through photosynthesis can travel through the fungal network and be taken up by another tree. Minerals that the fungus has absorbed from the soil can be distributed through the network to multiple trees. Signals, chemical signals, can pass through the network, allowing trees to communicate information about stresses and attacks. This network has been called the Wood Wide Web, and while that name is perhaps slightly sensationalized, the underlying phenomenon is real. A forest is not a collection of individual trees competing for resources. A forest is, in part, a network of trees connected through fungal threads, sharing resources, exchanging information, functioning, in some respects, as a collective system rather than a collection of independent individuals. There is evidence that large, old trees, the biggest trees in a forest, are hubs in this network, connected to many smaller trees around them. And these large trees have been observed to support neighboring trees that are in difficulty. Trees in shade, not receiving enough sunlight to photosynthesize adequately, have been found to receive carbon through the mycorrhizal network from nearby trees that are in full sun and producing more than they need. The large trees are, in effect, subsidizing their neighbors. This is extraordinary, not because trees are being altruistic in any conscious sense. They are not. They are responding to chemical gradients, to concentration differences in the network. Carbon flows from where it is abundant to where it is scarce, following the chemistry. But the result, at the level of the forest, looks like support, looks like sharing, looks like the kind of collective behavior that we associate with social animals. And this changes what a forest is. Not a collection of individuals competing for light and water and nutrients. A connected system in which the individuals are nodes and the connections are as important as the nodes. A system in which the health of one part affects the health of other parts. A system in which the largest and oldest members play a structural role, not just by providing shade and seed, but by serving as hubs in a network that distributes resources to where they are needed. The forest is not what it looks like from above. From above, it looks like a collection of trees. From below, from the perspective of the fungal network connecting the roots, it looks something more like a single organism, not literally a single organism, but a collective system with a level of integration and coordination that we had not previously suspected. Now I want to take this back to the original question. Where does the tree come from? Because I think the mycorrhizal network adds another dimension to the answer. The tree does not come from the ground, as Van Helmont's experiment showed. The bulk of its mass comes from the air, but the tree also does not come entirely from itself. It comes, in part, from its neighbors, from the network, from the collective system of the forest in which it is embedded. The carbon in a tree's wood came from the air, but the phosphorus that allowed the enzymes of photosynthesis to function may have come from a neighboring tree via the fungal network. The water that was split in the light reactions may have been accessed by fungal hyphae that also connect to the roots of a dozen other trees. The seedling that grew into the mature tree may have survived its first years in the shade of the forest floor only because it was receiving supplemental carbon from the larger trees around it through the network. The tree is an individual, but it is also part of a collective, made from the air, yes, but grown in partnership, sustained by connection, part of a system that is larger and more integrated than any single tree. Van Helmont weighed one tree in isolation, but trees do not grow in isolation. They grow in forests. And forests are something more than collections of isolated trees. And now I want to bring all of this back to something immediate, something personal. something that connects the extraordinary chemistry and physics and ecology I have been describing to the experience of standing under a tree and looking up. I want to tell you what I see when I look at a tree, not what everyone sees, not the bark and the leaves and the branches and the general impression of a large, green, living thing rooted in the ground. What I see when I actually look, when I bring to bear everything I know about the chemistry and the physics and the biology and the history and ask what is actually happening here right now in front of me. Because I think there is a specific kind of seeing that becomes available when you understand something deeply. Not a replacement for ordinary seeing. In addition to it, a layer of perception that is built on top of the ordinary visual experience by the understanding underneath it. And once you have it, you cannot turn it off. You look at the tree and you see the tree, and simultaneously you see everything the understanding reveals about the tree. The two perceptions are not separate. They are one experience. So let me tell you what that experience is like for a tree, for me. I look at the leaves, and I see them as solar panels, yes, as light harvesting machines, but more specifically, I see them as the place where the boundary between the atmosphere and the living world is most active, where the transaction is happening most intensely, where carbon dioxide molecules are arriving from the air at a rate of billions per second per leaf, being caught by RuBisCO, being stripped of their carbon, being incorporated into the growing structure of the tree. I see the leaves as the interface, the place where air becomes wood. And I know that this interface is not just a surface, it is an enormous surface. A mature oak tree has roughly 200,000 leaves. Each leaf has a surface area of roughly 20 square centimeters. Total leaf surface area, roughly 4,000 square meters. But that is just the upper surface. The internal surface area of all those leaves, the surfaces of all the cells inside the leaves where the actual gas exchange happens, is much larger, perhaps 10 times larger, 40,000 square meters, the size of several football fields, folded into the space occupied by a single tree. And every square centimeter of that internal surface area is in direct contact with the atmosphere. Breathing it, absorbing it, processing it, the tree is not a solid object with a surface. The tree is an interface. A structure whose entire purpose is to maximize contact between the chemistry of life and the chemistry of the atmosphere. Then I look at the trunk, and I see it as a record, a historical document, a layer-by-layer archive of every year the tree has lived. Each ring of wood is a year. A good year, abundant water and sunlight, produces a thick ring. A bad year, drought or disease or unusually cold temperatures, produces a thin ring. A fire that scarred the tree decades ago appears as an anomaly in the ring pattern. An attack by insects appears as a period of narrow rings. The entire history of the tree's life, encoded in the concentric rings of wood, each ring made from atmospheric carbon fixed during that specific year. Dendrochronology, the reading of tree rings, a way of reconstructing climate history going back thousands of years in the longest-lived trees. The tree has been keeping records. Not intentionally, but the record is there, written in wood, written in carbon that came from air. And when I look at the trunk, I also see the xylem inside it, invisible from the outside, but I know it is there. The water-conducting tissue, the dead cells whose walls have been thickened and lignified to withstand the negative pressures of the cohesion tension mechanism. I see the water moving upward through it right now. If it is a warm day and the tree is transpiring, pulled by the evaporative demand at the leaves, flowing upward against gravity without any pump, the continuous water column, extending from the finest root hairs in the soil to the smallest veins in the highest leaves, held together by the hydrogen bonds between water molecules, maintained by the adhesion of water to the xylem walls, a column of liquid under tension, defying the intuition that says water cannot be pulled upward through tubes. And I see the phloem alongside the xylem, the living transport tissue moving sugars downward from the leaves to everywhere in the tree that needs carbon and energy. Moving the products of photosynthesis, the glucose converted to sucrose from the source, the photosynthesizing leaves, to the sink, the growing root tips and the developing seeds, and the expanding cambium. The entire tree supplied with carbon and energy through this living pipeline, this river of sugar flowing under pressure, generated by the osmotic loading and unloading of sucrose at source and sink. And then I look at the roots, not the visible base of the trunk where it enters the soil, but the invisible extent of the root system spreading through the soil in every direction. A mature tree may have hundreds of kilometers of fine roots, not the thick structural roots you can see at the base. The fine absorbing roots, the root hairs, the mycorrhizal hyphae extending from them, creating a network of biological threads extending through the soil in a volume many times larger than the volume of the above ground part of the tree. And I see this root fungal network as a mining operation, a biological mining operation of extraordinary sophistication, extracting water and dissolved minerals from the soil at a spatial resolution that no mechanical mining operation could approach. Reaching into pores too small for any root, along chemical gradients too subtle for any root to detect, guided by the chemistry of mineral concentrations in ways that maximize the efficiency of extraction. And I see the connections to neighboring trees, the fungal threads extending beyond this tree's root zone and connecting to the roots of the trees around it. The network of shared biology that makes the forest a collective as much as a collection. The possibility that the carbon fixed by this tree's photosynthesis today might be in a neighboring tree's cells tomorrow, transferred through the network. The possibility that the stress signals from a tree being attacked by insects on the other side of the forest might be traveling through this network right now, preparing trees throughout the forest for a defense response before the insects arrive. I see all of this when I look at a tree, not as separate sequential thoughts, as a single, simultaneous, layered perception. The tree as a surface, as a record, as a transport network, as a mining operation, as a node in a collective system. The tree is organized air. The tree has captured sunlight. The tree has 400 million years of accumulated biological wisdom encoded in DNA and expressed in wood and leaf and root. And I want to be honest about what this does to me, what this kind of seeing actually feels like. Because I think there is a widespread belief that scientific understanding diminishes wonder, that knowing how something works makes it less beautiful, less mysterious, less worthy of the kind of awe that we feel when we do not understand something. I think this is exactly backwards, and the tree is the clearest example I know of why it is backwards. Before I understood photosynthesis, a tree was impressive, large, living, green, old. Impressive in the way that large things are impressive and living things are impressive. But the impression was shallow. It was a response to the surface, to the size and the age and the greenness, not to what the tree actually was. After I understood photosynthesis, after I understood the Calvin cycle and RuBisCO and the cohesion tension mechanism and the mycorrhizal networks and the evolutionary history of land plants, the tree became something else entirely. Not less impressive, more. Not less mysterious, more. Because now I could see what was actually happening. And what was actually happening was far stranger and far more extraordinary than anything the surface impression suggested. The surface impression says, here is a large, old, living thing. The understanding says, here is a structure built from invisible gas using sunlight captured by molecular machinery of extraordinary sophistication, lifting hundreds of liters of water against gravity every day without any pump, maintained by a network of fungal connections to its neighbors, encoding the history of its entire life in concentric rings of wood, representing the current endpoint of 400 million years of evolutionary refinement. And doing all of this without a brain, without conscious intention, without any of the deliberate engineering that the achievement would seem to demand. The understanding does not replace the wonder. The understanding is the wonder. Or rather, the understanding reveals what the wonder is actually pointing at. Before understanding, you feel something in the presence of the tree that you might call wonder, but that is actually a response to size and age and aliveness, which are real but surface properties. After understanding, the same feeling is now pointing at something real and specific and deep. The wonder has found its object. This is what I think Keats got wrong, the poet who complained that Newton had destroyed the rainbow by explaining it. Newton did not destroy the rainbow. Newton revealed what the rainbow actually was. And what it actually was, a demonstration of the wavelength-dependent refraction of light, a physical phenomenon connecting the geometry of raindrops to the structure of sunlight, was more extraordinary than the simple visual experience of seeing colors in the sky. Understanding the rainbow did not make it less beautiful. It made it beautiful in a way that the ignorant eye could not access, a deeper, more specific, more earned beauty. The same is true of the tree. The same is true in my experience of everything. There is a beauty that is available only to the eye that understands, not instead of the beauty available to the ignorant eye. In addition to it, a layer of wonder that only becomes visible when the understanding underneath it has been built. And this is why I think science is not just useful, not just powerful, not just the most reliable method we have for understanding how the world works. It is beautiful. It adds to the experience of the world rather than subtracting from it. It gives you more to see, not less. It makes the ordinary extraordinary, not by adding anything to it, but by revealing what was already there, hidden in plain sight, waiting to be seen by anyone who looked carefully enough. Van Helmont looked at a tree and asked where it came from. He was doing science. He was applying measurement and reason to a question that everyone thought they knew the answer to. And his measurement revealed that the obvious answer was wrong. The tree did not come from the ground, which meant the answer was somewhere else, which meant there was something to find. It took another 2.5 centuries to find it fully. To understand photosynthesis at the molecular level, to understand the Calvin cycle and RuBisCO and the light reactions and the electron transport chain, to understand that the tree was built from air, that the carbon dioxide floating invisibly around Van Helmont as he conducted his experiment was the very material from which the tree was made. And when you know that, when you really know it, not just as a fact, but as a deep, integrated understanding, when you look at a tree and see it as organized air, as captured sunlight, as 400 million years of evolutionary refinement, expressed in cellulose and lignin and chlorophyll, you are seeing something real, something true, something that was always there, waiting to be seen, since the first tree ever stood in the sun and began pulling the sky into wood. The tree does not come from the ground. The tree comes from the light and the air and the water and 4 billion years of biological history and the slow, patient, relentless work of evolution and the extraordinary molecular machinery of photosynthesis and the fungal networks in the soil and the hydrogen bonds between water molecules, and the carbon atoms that cycle endlessly between the living world and the atmosphere. The tree comes from everything. And the ground, the humble, ordinary, underfoot ground that everyone assumed was the answer, is just where the tree stands while it does the real work of pulling itself out of thin air. The next time you walk past a tree, I want you to stop for a moment. Not for long. Just long enough to actually look. Not at the surface, through it, at the billions of carbon dioxide molecules entering the leaves right now, at the water column under tension in the xylem, at the sugars flowing downward in the phloem, at the mycorrhizal threads connecting this tree to its neighbors, at the 400 million years of accumulated wisdom encoded in the DNA of every cell, at the organized air, at the captured sky, at the most extraordinary engineering project in the history of the planet, running continuously, silently, right in front of you, hiding behind the perfectly ordinary appearance of a tree. The universe is not hiding its wonders behind difficult mathematics and expensive equipment. It is hiding them in plain sight, in things so familiar that you have stopped looking at them.